maybe the most underrated personality in the game, just because he's so stoic, and a lot of times with the media, it's very monotone and not a whole lot of emotion.
He's FC King pathetic. Sounds like the kind of brutal line people expect from a story about Lance Berkman, because Berkman never built his baseball life around staying quiet. He was funny, he was gifted. He was honest in a way that most players never dared to be. But that honesty did not always feel like courage. Sometimes it felt like judgment. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. Picture Lance Berkman years after his playing career ended. He was no longer just the funny slugger from Houston they called the Big Puma. He had become something else. The polarizing figure. The man whose blunt personality followed him into politics, into public criticism, and into the coaching world. Teen 2023, he was ejected as the head coach of Houston Christian University. He argued a call at second base, lost his temper, and threw his hat into the stands in front of everyone watching. A few months later, in May of 2024, he stepped down from that same coaching job for good. If you think stories like this deserve more attention, use the hype feature and give this video some hype so more baseball fans can discover it. Because what happened next in Berkman's story shows exactly why his fire never really cooled down. That ejection and that resignation were proof that the fire inside Lance Berkman did not disappear the moment his playing career ended. The same blunt honesty that got him tossed from a college dugout had been simmering inside him since his very first days in the major leagues. Watch the footage of that ejection closely and you can see it. This was not a man simply frustrated with one bad call. This was the same competitive fire, the same refusal to stay quiet that had defined every stage of his baseball life. Coaches around college baseball who worked alongside him during those years often described him as blunt and demanding, someone who expected the same standards from his players that he once held himself to as a professional. That demand for honesty, for effort, and for respect never left him even decades after he had stopped playing the sport professionally. And it explains why so many people who crossed paths with him, from teammates to broadcasters to college umpires, all describe the very same thing. So here's the real question about Lance Berkman. How did one of the best switch hitters of his generation become remembered not only for his bat, but for the players, the ballparks, and the baseball cultures he openly criticized? How does a man who hit for average, hit for power, and walked more than almost anyone in the game end up talked about just as much for his mouth as for his swing? To understand that, you have to go back to where it all started long before the coaching jobs and the public controversies. Back to a young player who was given every reason in the world to believe he had earned the right to speak his mind, because the fire we just saw in that college dugout in 2023 was not something new. It was the same fire that had been burning quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, for his entire life in professional baseball. It showed up in a Yankee Stadium batting cage, in a Houston radio interview, in a quiet clubhouse morning, and on a baseball field in Milwaukee, long before it ever showed up on a college diamond in 2023. Before we get into the players Berkman clashed with, you need to understand why anyone even cared what he had to say in the first place. Lance Berkman was not some bench player desperate for attention. He was drafted 16th overall by the Houston Astros in 1997, straight out of Rice University. He quickly became part of one of the most beloved lineups in franchise history, standing alongside Hall of Famers Jeff Bagwell and Craig Biggio in what fans called the Killer Bees. The Berkman was a switch hitter, which means he could bat from either side of the plate, and he did it as well as almost anyone who ever played the game. Over his career, he hit 293 with a .406 on-base percentage, a .537 slugging percentage, and an adjusted OPS of 144. Those numbers put him near the very top of the list of great switch hitters in baseball history. Think about what that combination of skills actually means for a player. 293 shows he could make consistent contact. The .537 slugging percentage shows he could drive the ball with real power. But that .406 on-base percentage might be the most telling number of all, because it shows discipline. The Berkman was not just a free swinger hoping to get lucky. He studied pitchers. He understood the strike zone better than almost anyone in the league, and he made opposing pitchers work for every single out. That kind of complete offensive skill set does not happen by accident. It takes years of preparation, film study, and mental discipline, and Berkman had all three. This matters because it changes how you should think about everything that comes next. Berkman was not a nobody trying to make noise so people would notice him. He was great enough that people already noticed him. When he talked, teammates and rivals listened because his bat had already earned him the right to have an opinion. But that is exactly what made his criticism so much more powerful and so much more damaging. The quiet bench player mouthing off can be ignored. The star switch hitter mouthing off becomes a headline. And Lance Berkman created a lot of headlines. Part of what made people listen so closely was the mix of confidence and humor Berkman carried with him everywhere. He was not the type of star who hid behind carefully rehearsed answers in interviews. He said what he actually thought, whether the topic was his own performance, a rival team, or the state of the sport itself. That honesty made him one of the most quotable players of his generation, but it also meant that nearly every opinion he shared had the potential to turn into a controversy the moment it left his mouth. Teammates who played alongside Berkman during his prime years in Houston often talked about how much energy he brought to a clubhouse. He was the kind of player who kept things loose during a long, grinding season, cracking jokes and keeping teammates relaxed even during difficult stretches. That same personality made him beloved inside his own organization for years. The trouble came when that same bluntness got pointed outward, at opponents, at rival organizations, or at teammates who did not share his sense of humor. Now let's count down the 4 players who came to define Lance Berkman's most personal conflicts in baseball. We start with number 4. The number 4 is Jeff Kent, and this one is the smallest conflict on the list, but it might reveal the most about who Berkman really was. Jeff Kent was Berkman's own teammate on the Houston Astros, and the two men could not have been more different. The Berkman was famously social. He loved talking to opposing players, umpires, and anyone else who happened to be nearby. He treated the clubhouse like one big ongoing conversation. Jeff Kent was the exact opposite. He was quiet, distant, and known across baseball for being difficult to approach. He did not make small talk, and he did not pretend to enjoy anyone's company just to keep the peace. Kent had built that reputation over years, playing in different clubhouses long before he ever arrived in Houston. Teammates across the league generally understood that Kent kept to himself, and most players simply respected that boundary and left him alone. It was not seen as rude so much as it was seen as who he was. Baseball clubhouses are full of different personality types, and most veteran players learn to accept that not everyone wants to chat before a game. One morning in the clubhouse, Berkman did what he always did. He greeted Kent with a simple good morning. Kent said nothing back. He did not nod. He did not grunt. He just ignored him completely, as if Berkman had not spoken at all. For most players, that kind of silence would have been brushed off, but Berkman did not let it go. He confronted Kent directly and told him that in a civilized society, when someone says good morning to you, you say it back. Kent apparently found the whole thing funny and laughed the tension away, and the moment passed without becoming a real feud. But look at what this small story actually says about Berkman. He did not only clash with rivals on other teams, he was willing to clash with his own teammate over something as small as a greeting. He wanted social connection so badly that even total silence from a quiet coworker felt like a personal insult to him. The most players would let a stoic teammate be stoic and move on with their day. The Berkman demanded that people meet him on his terms, even inside his own clubhouse. It is a small window into a bigger truth about him. The Berkman was not just reacting to enemies who provoked him, he had a low tolerance for anyone, teammate or opponent, who did not operate the way he believed people should operate. Even in a moment as small as an unreturned good morning, Berkman needed the world around him to follow his own social rules, and when it didn't, he said something about it. It is worth remembering that Kent was not some rookie who did not understand clubhouse etiquette. He was an accomplished veteran, a former MVP, and someone who had earned the right to carry himself however he wanted after years of success in the league. The Berkman still felt entitled to confront him about it anyway. That says something important about how Berkman viewed his own role in a clubhouse. He was not simply a peacekeeper trying to smooth over awkward moments. He was someone who believed his own standards of behavior applied to everyone around him, no matter how much respect that other person had already earned elsewhere in their career. The number 3 is Nyjer Morgan, and this conflict shows a very different side of Berkman, one where his defensive tradition started to look a lot like gatekeeping. During the 2011 National League Championship Series, the St. Louis Cardinals faced the Milwaukee Brewers, and tension between the two teams became impossible to ignore. Nyjer Morgan had built a loud, theatrical persona for himself that fans and media nicknamed Tony Plush. He talked trash constantly, and during that postseason run, he directed insults at Albert Pujols and threw tobacco in the direction of Cardinals pitcher Chris Carpenter. The Brewers, led by Morgan's antics, became one of the most disliked opponents in the league that year. The rivalry between these two clubs had built up over the course of an entire season, and by the time October arrived, both benches were on edge every time the two teams took the field together. The Morgan seemed to feed off the tension, using it to fuel his energetic, over-the-top style of play. For a lot of younger fans, that kind of personality made the series more entertaining to watch. 4 veteran players raised in a more traditional era of the sport. It looked like exactly the kind of behavior that baseball was supposed to discourage. When reporters asked Berkman directly about the animosity between the two clubs, he did not dodge the question. He confirmed that the two teams genuinely disliked each other, and he used the moment to defend what he called the foundation rules of baseball. In Berkman's mind, that meant showing respect for the game itself and respect for your opponent. He specifically criticized Morgan's habit of celebrating wildly after a big moment. Berkman compared a pitcher's flashy celebration after striking him out to a hitter backpedaling all the way to first base after hitting a home run. To Berkman, both were embarrassing displays that had no place in a game built on quiet professionalism. Here's where the story gets complicated. The Berkman framed himself as a defender of respect, but from another angle, he looks more like a gatekeeper trying to protect an old version of baseball that was already changing without his permission. Morgan was loud and theatrical, sure, but he was not committing any crime against the sport. He was simply playing with more personality than Berkman's generation was used to seeing. Instead of accepting that baseball culture was shifting toward more personal expression, Berkman treated Morgan's style like it was a genuine threat to the integrity of the game. He wanted baseball played his way on his terms, according to rules that he and his era had decided were the correct ones. That is not exactly the same thing as simply respecting the game, and it is worth asking whether Berkman's real objection was about respect at all, whether it was simply about control over how the sport was supposed to look. Consider how this same argument has played out again and again across baseball history. Every generation of veteran players tends to believe the players coming up behind them are somehow disrespecting the game, whether through celebrations, personality, or simple confidence. The Berkman was firmly on one side of that generational divide, defending a quieter, more restrained version of professionalism against a newer style built around personality and self-expression. The history has generally sided with players like Morgan on this question, as baseball has only grown louder and more expressive in the years since. That makes Berkman's insistence on quiet professionalism feel less like timeless wisdom and more like one man's preference, dressed up as a universal rule. Number 2 is C.J. Wilson, and this conflict shows exactly how Berkman's blunt honesty could ignite a fire with a single sentence. In January of 2011, right after signing a free agent deal with the St. Louis Cardinals, Berkman sat down for a radio interview back home in Houston. He was asked about the Texas Rangers, and he did not hold back. He predicted that the Rangers would take a step backward without their ace pitcher Cliff Lee, and he went further, calling their entire 2010 pitching success fluky, as if it had been more luck than skill. That comment landed at a strange moment for the Rangers organization. The team had just come off a surprising run to the World Series, and Texas fans were still riding high on the excitement of finally seeing their franchise compete at the highest level. For an outsider and a player who had just chosen a different team in free agency, to publicly dismiss that success as fluky felt like a direct shot at everything the Rangers had just accomplished. The day, Wilson, a key member of that Rangers rotation, was not going to let that slide. He fired back publicly on Dallas radio, mocking Berkman as washed up and suggesting he was just a fading player, thinking about retirement whose opinions did not carry any real weight anymore. It was a sharp response to a sharp comment, and for a while, the two players were locked in a real public back and forth that local media in both cities were happy to keep covering. What makes this story interesting is not just the insult itself, but what it reveals about Berkman's pattern. He seemed to genuinely believe he was just offering an honest, analytical opinion about a rival team's chances. But honest opinions delivered by a veteran star from an opposing team do not always land as harmless analysis. They can sound arrogant even when the person saying them believes they are simply telling the truth. The Berkman eventually smoothed things over in a lighthearted way, leaving a handwritten apology note on Wilson's locker during the All-Star game, which the two of them were able to laugh about. Notice the order of events. The damage always came first. The charm came second. The Berkman would say something blunt enough to start a real conflict, and only after the fire had already spread would he step in with humor to put it out. It is a pattern you will see again and again throughout his career. A blunt comment followed eventually by a clever gesture that made people forget how much the original comment had actually stung. There is also something worth noticing in how quickly Wilson's response escalated the whole situation. A single radio comment about pitching performance turned into a cross-city media feud within days, with reporters in both Houston and Dallas happy to keep the story alive. That escalation says something about the media environment Berkman operated in. Any blunt comment he made had the potential to snowball into something much bigger than he probably intended, simply because he was famous enough and honest enough that his words always carried weight. Number 1 is Alex Rodriguez, and this is the conflict that best represents everything Berkman claimed to hate about modern image-conscious baseball. The after Berkman was traded from Houston to the New York Yankees in the middle of the 2010 season, he found himself in a completely different world. He was used to the loose, blue-collar energy of a National League clubhouse, Instead, he found what he described as a sterile, corporate atmosphere at Yankee Stadium, one that felt underwhelming compared to the intensity he expected from a championship franchise. That culture shock alone would have been a difficult adjustment for any player switching leagues and organizations in the middle of a season. But for someone like Berkman, who valued loud personality and easy camaraderie above almost everything else in a clubhouse, landing with the Yankees may have felt like walking into a completely different sport. The buttoned-up professionalism that made the Yankees one of the most successful franchises in history was, in Berkman's eyes, exactly the kind of corporate polish he had spent his whole career avoiding. The Berkman focused much of that frustration on Alex Rodriguez specifically. He made a pointed comment that Rodriguez pays someone to make sure his belt is in his pants. On the surface, that sounds like a joke about grooming or fashion, but it was really a comment about image. The Berkman saw Rodriguez as someone who managed every detail of his public appearance, someone whose entire persona felt curated and performed rather than natural. To Berkman, that kind of image management was the opposite of what a real baseball player should care about. That underlying tension became physical during batting practice in August of 2010. The Berkman hit a hardline drive that struck Rodriguez directly in the shin. The Rodriguez went down dramatically, and several Yankees teammates who were already used to what they saw as his exaggerated reactions laughed openly instead of rushing over with concern. For Berkman, that moment captured everything he found frustrating about Rodriguez and the culture surrounding him. But look closely at what this conflict actually says about Berkman, not just about Rodriguez. Even if Alex Rodriguez really was more image conscious than his teammates, Berkman's reaction reveals just as much about his own personality. He did not simply notice a difference in how another player carried himself. He judged it, mocked it, and turned one teammate into a symbol for everything he believed was fake about modern baseball. That is a heavier reaction than a simple personality clash. It shows a man who was quick to decide that people who did not match his own values were somehow less authentic, less worthy of respect, even when those people had done nothing wrong to him personally. The Berkman never had to make Rodriguez the face of everything he disliked about the Yankees. He chose to, and that choice says something lasting about how Berkman handled people who were simply different from him. It also raises a fair question about who really gets to decide what counts as authentic in professional sports. Berkman built his own identity around being blunt, funny, and unpolished, and he clearly valued that identity a great deal. But turning that personal preference into a standard for judging teammates, especially one as talented and accomplished as Alex Rodriguez, put Berkman in the position of deciding whose personality was acceptable and whose personality deserved public mockery. That is a lot of authority for one player to claim over another, even one wearing a different uniform in a completely different clubhouse culture. Those four conflicts, from Jeff Kent's silence to Alex Rodriguez's shin, were never really isolated incidents. They were part of a much bigger pattern, because Berkman did not just criticize players, he criticized ballparks, leagues, front offices, and entire baseball cultures with the same blunt honesty. Take Wrigley Field, the historic home of the Chicago Cubs. The Berkman openly called it one of the worst places in baseball for almost anything, and the only exception he was willing to give it was as a place for people to go and drink beer. That harsh opinion lined up with his results there too. Across 289 career at-bats at Wrigley, Berkman batted a weak .215, far below the standards he set everywhere else in his career. It is worth pointing out how unusual it was for a player to say something like that about one of the most beloved, historic ballparks in the entire sport. Wrigley Field is considered sacred ground by generations of baseball fans, filled with ivy-covered walls and decades of tradition. For most players, criticizing it publicly would have felt almost disrespectful to the game's history. For Berkman, none of that mattered. If he did not like a place, he said so, regardless of how much nostalgia surrounded it. But even in a place he claimed to hate, Berkman could not help being genuinely funny. During one game at Wrigley, Cubs fans in the bleachers tried to mock his weight by waving Twinkies at him from the stands. Instead of getting angry, Berkman gestured for them to throw the Twinkies down to him. He caught 2 of them in his glove, ate one right there on the field, and stuffed the other one in his pocket. Then, in his very next at-bat, he hit a home run. The same fans who had been mocking him ended up chanting Twinkie power as he rounded the bases. That story shows exactly why people forgave Berkman for being so harsh. He could insult an entire ballpark and its fan base, and then turn around and win those same fans over with one clever, funny moment. That charm made it easy to overlook how sharp his tongue really was. People remembered the laugh. They forgot the insult that came right before it. It is a perfect summary of Berkman's entire public relationship with baseball fans everywhere he played. He would say something blunt enough to upset people, and then, almost like magic, a joke or a big swing would erase the tension entirely. That Twinkie moment has become one of the most repeated stories stories from Berkman's career, told and retold by broadcasters and fans for years afterward, captures something rare about him. The most players facing that kind of mockery from an opposing crowd would simply ignore it or get frustrated by it. The Berkman turned it into pure entertainment, and in doing so, he reminded everyone why fans genuinely liked him even when he was saying harsh things about their own ballpark. It is one of the clearest examples of how his humor consistently bought him forgiveness that a less charming player never would have received. Berkman's criticism was not limited to one stadium either. He carried a deep ideological dislike for the entire American League, and specifically for the designated hitter rule. He called the American League a Mickey Mouse format, arguing that letting a player hit without ever playing defense stripped away the strategic depth that made traditional National League baseball so interesting to him. For Berkman, baseball strategy meant thinking several innings ahead, managing a pitcher's spot in the lineup, and making decisions about double switches and pinch hitters that simply did not exist in a league where the pitcher never had to bat. To him, the National League style of play required more thought from managers and more well-rounded skill from players. Removing that requirement, in his mind, made the American League version of the sport feel simpler and less demanding. That belief made his final major league season in 2013 with the Texas Rangers deeply ironic. The Rangers signed him to a significant contract, specifically to be their designated hitter, the very role he had spent years dismissing as fake baseball. The Berkman was open about how much he disliked playing in Arlington. He criticized the brutal Texas heat, the organization itself, and even the fan base, all while dealing with a rough, injury-shortened season that limited him to just 73 games. On top of that, reports at the time suggested Berkman never built a real working relationship with Rangers star Adrian Beltre. He also criticized the Rangers front office directly, pointing at the large contract they had given Beltre and suggesting it was far more money than industry experts believed the third baseman was actually worth. On top of everything else going wrong that season, Berkman's body simply would not cooperate the way it once had, and the constant injuries only added to the frustration surrounding his final year in the league. For a player who had spent his entire career building trust with teammates through humor and easy conversation, failing to connect with a star like Beltre stood out as unusual. The Beltre was widely respected across the league for his quiet professionalism and his defensive excellence at third base, and yet even that kind of universally admired player could not seem to build a real relationship with Berkman during his brief time in Texas. It suggests that by this stage of his career, whether from frustration, injury, or simple exhaustion, Berkman's usual charm was running thin. By this point in his career, Berkman's honesty did not feel brave anymore. It felt exhausting. He had taken the money, accepted the DH role he claimed to hate, and still found things to criticize about the very team paying his salary. It is one thing to speak your mind as an idealistic young player, trying to protect the traditions of the sport. It is another thing entirely to take a paycheck for the exact role you have spent years mocking and then complain about the organization writing that check. Looking back, that final Rangers season serves almost as a compressed version of Berkman's entire career. He arrived with strong opinions about how baseball should work. He collided with the reality of a league, a role, and an organization that did not match those opinions. He said exactly what he thought about it, regardless of how that honesty might look to people paying his salary. And in the end, his outspoken nature left him remembered as much for the friction he created as for the production he still managed to provide, even in an injury-shortened, difficult final year. All of that criticism, aimed at teammates, opponents, ballparks, and entire leagues, makes what happened next feel even more unfair. Because for all his bluntness, Lance Berkman was one of the most statistically underrated players of his generation, and almost nobody outside of Houston seemed to notice. Among switch hitters in the entire history of Major League Baseball, Berkman's career rate statistics are surpassed only by Mickey Mantle. Think about that for a moment. The only Mickey Mantle produced better numbers from both sides of the plate than Lance Berkman did. He finished his career with 366 home runs, 1,208 walks, a .406 on-base percentage, a .943 OPS, and that elite .144 adjusted OPS. Those are the kinds of numbers that usually guarantee a player a serious Hall of Fame conversation. Put those numbers in perspective. Compare Berkman to other great hitters from his era who played a similar role. David Ortiz finished his career with a .380 on-base percentage and a .141 adjusted OPS. The Edgar Martinez finished with a .418 on-base percentage and a .147 adjusted OPS. The Berkman's numbers sit right alongside both of those Hall of Fame caliber careers. The Ortiz was inducted into the Hall of Fame in his very first year of eligibility, receiving nearly 78% of the vote. The Edgar Martinez eventually made it in as well after 10 years on the ballot. The Berkman, with numbers that stack up against both of them, did not get anywhere close to that kind of recognition. Instead, Berkman was bounced off the Hall of Fame ballot after just one single year of eligibility in 2019. He received only 5 votes, just one, 4% of the total, nowhere close to the 5% threshold required to stay on future ballots. For a player with numbers this strong, that outcome shocked plenty of baseball historians and statisticians. There are real reasons behind that snub, and they connect directly back to who Berkman was as a player and as a person. He walked an incredible amount during his career, which boosted his on-base percentage but also limited his total hit count. He finished with 1,905 hits, just short of the 2,000 hit milestone that traditional voters love to see, and he never reached 400 home runs either. He spent most of his prime playing in Houston, a market that national baseball media has historically overlooked compared to cities on the coasts. And playing in the same division as Albert Pujols meant that even Berkman's best seasons were constantly overshadowed by one of the greatest hitters baseball had ever produced. But there is another layer to this story that the numbers alone cannot fully explain. The Berkman was famously self-deprecating. During slumps, he would openly tell reporters that he stunk, and he would say there was nothing any journalist could write about him that was harsher than what he already believed about himself. That kind of brutal honesty about his own play might sound refreshing, but it also made it easier for Hall of Fame voters to simply forget about him. He never protected his own image the way other stars did. He criticized too much, joked too much, and refused to smooth over his rough edges. And in the end, that same personality that made him fascinating to watch may have made him easier to overlook when it mattered most. Players like David Ortiz built loyal, protective relationships with the media covering them for years. The Berkman did the opposite. He gave reporters honest, blunt, sometimes self-critical quotes, and while that made for entertaining articles in the moment, it did nothing to build the kind of lasting media goodwill that often decides Hall of Fame elections. Sabermetricians and baseball historians have pointed to Berkman's snub as one of the most glaring examples of how a Hall of Fame vote can fail to match the actual numbers a player produced. It raises an uncomfortable question about the entire voting process. If a player with rate statistics this close to Mickey Mantle can fall off the ballot after a single year, then something other than pure performance clearly plays a role in these decisions. The market size, media relationships, personal image, and public perception all seem to matter just as much as batting average and on-base percentage. The Berkman's career stands as a permanent reminder of that uncomfortable truth, a reminder that greatness on the field does not always translate into recognition once a career is finished. That same personality followed Berkman well beyond his playing days, and it became even more polarizing once he stepped away from baseball completely. Guided by his deeply conservative Christian faith, Berkman became heavily involved in public advocacy in Houston after retirement. In 2015, he became the public face of a campaign opposing the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, a proposed law designed to prevent discrimination in public spaces, including protections for transgender individuals. In TV and radio commercials, Berkman used the phrase "troubled men" to describe transgender women, warning that the ordinance would compromise the safety and privacy of women and girls in public restrooms. That campaign triggered a severe backlash. The supporters of the ordinance condemned Berkman's commercials as fear-mongering and discriminatory, and the backlash from the LGBTQ+ community and progressive baseball fans followed him for years afterward. For a man who had built much of his public image around humor and easygoing charm, this was a completely different kind of controversy. Two very different versions of Lance Berkman now existed at the same time, the beloved former Astro and the polarizing political figure. And for many fans, it became difficult to hold both versions in their head without one coloring the other. The Berkman later sat down for a long 45-minute conversation with journalist Craig Calcaterra, where he expressed regret specifically for using the phrase "troubled men," clarified that he did not believe online criticism was the same thing as real persecution. That conversation showed a more reflective side of Berkman, someone willing to acknowledge that a specific choice of words had caused real harm. But by then, the damage to his public reputation was already permanent, and no single interview was going to undo years of backlash. That controversy resurfaced again in 2017 when the St. Louis Cardinals invited Berkman to speak at their annual Christian Day event. The invitation sparked intense public protest, and the organization was forced to release formal statements defending their decision, leaning heavily on Berkman's history with the franchise's 2011 championship roster to justify the choice. It was a strange full-circle moment. The same team that once celebrated him as a championship hero now had to publicly defend why they were still associating with him. Came his coaching career, and the same fire came right along with him. He served as an assistant coach at the University of St. Thomas before taking over as head coach of the Houston Christian Huskies from 2022 through 2024. That is where his 2023 ejection happened, the one where he threw his hat into the stands during a heated argument over a call at second base. He stepped down from that job in May of 2024, closing the book on a coaching career that had been defined by the same uncompromising intensity that shaped his entire life in baseball. From his earliest days needling teammates in a Houston clubhouse to his final days arguing with umpires as a college coach, the pattern never really changed. Whether he was hitting home runs, criticizing rival teams, or standing on a college baseball field, decades after his playing days ended. The core of Lance Berkman stayed remarkably consistent. He believed in speaking his mind. He believed in holding people, including himself, to a strict standard, and he never seemed particularly worried about how that honesty might be received. That consistency is part of what makes his story so compelling. He was never a different person depending on the situation. He was simply Lance Berkman, everywhere, all the time, whether people liked it or not. So, where does that leave the legacy of Lance Berkman? He was not a fraud. He was not a bad player, pretending to be something he wasn't. He was genuinely one of the best switch hitters of his entire era, a key piece of great Houston teams, a man with real humor and real courage. He also had real flaws, and those flaws followed him from clubhouse arguments all the way into his post-career public life. Think back over everything we just walked. A young player drafted 16th overall who turned into one of the most complete hitters of his generation. A teammate who could not let a silent good morning slide. A rival who could not resist calling another team's success fluky. A veteran who publicly clashed with a brash young outfielder over what respect for the game actually meant. A star who turned one teammate's fashion choices into a symbol of everything fake about modern baseball. A player who insulted an entire historic ballpark, then won its fans back with a Twinkie and a home run in the very same afternoon. A man who mocked an entire league's style of play, then took its money in his final season and complained the whole way through. And finally, a Hall of Fame caliber career that got dismissed in a single year of voting, followed by a post-career life defined by public controversy just as much as it was by baseball nostalgia. The real tragedy of Lance Berkman's story is that his bat deserved so much more respect than it ever received, but his mouth made him harder for people to fully celebrate. Alex Rodriguez showed exactly what Berkman hated about image and performance in modern baseball. Wilson showed what happened when Berkman's honest analysis crossed the line into something that felt like an insult. Ninger Morgan showed just how strict Berkman's personal code of respect really was. And Jeff Kent proved that even a quiet, harmless teammate could set him off if they did not meet him on his own terms. Lance Berkman was without question a great baseball player, but his story also proves something else entirely. Sometimes the loudest voice in the clubhouse is exactly what makes a legacy harder to love. Baseball history is full of quiet, well-liked players whose numbers were never quite good enough to earn Cooperstown, and it is also full of difficult, outspoken stars who made it in any way because their talent was simply too large to ignore. Lance Berkman falls into a rarer category. His talent absolutely belonged in that final group, but his personality kept pulling him back toward the first. He was too honest for his own good, too willing to say what he actually believed, and too unwilling to play the careful, image-conscious game that so many other stars mastered. In the end, that made him one of the most fascinating players of his generation to watch, and also one of the hardest to fully embrace. His bat said one true thing, his mouth said another, and baseball history, in the end, chose to remember both, side by side, for as long as people keep telling stories about this game.